From the moment early humans learned to fear the dark, fear began shaping the world we live in. Long before laws, nations, or kings existed, fear was humanity's first teacher. It warned of predators lurking in shadows, of storms that could wipe out entire tribes, of starvation waiting beyond failed hunts. Survival depended on recognizing danger quickly and obeying the signals that fear sent through the body. Those who ignored it rarely lived long enough to pass on their stories. Over time, fear became more than instinct. It became structure. As humans formed groups, fear transformed into a social force. Communities learned that shared fear created unity. The fear of wild animals pushed people to gather around fires. The fear of outsiders created borders long before walls were built. The fear of the unknown gave birth to myths, spirits, and unseen forces that demanded respect. In these early civilizations, fear explained what logic could not. Thunder became the anger of gods. Disease became punishment. Drought became a warning. Fear gave meaning to chaos, and meaning gave humans the illusion of control. As settlements grew into cities, fear evolved again. It was no longer just about survival. It became a tool. Leaders emerged not only because they were strong, but because they promised protection. Protection from enemies, protection from hunger, protection from divine wrath. In exchange, people offered obedience. Fear silently rewrote the social contract. Those at the top learned that safety could be sold, but fear ensured payment. The greater the fear, the tighter the control. Early rulers understood something powerful. People obey faster when they are afraid than when they are convinced. Fear didn't need explanations. It bypassed reason and went straight to instinct. When danger felt immediate, questioning authority felt risky. Slowly, fear embedded itself into governance. Laws were enforced not just through fairness, but through consequence. Punishment became a message, not only to the victim, but to everyone watching. Civilization advanced, but fear walked alongside it, growing more refined with each generation. Religion became one of fear's most effective vehicles. Invisible consequences were more powerful than visible ones. When fear extended beyond death, obedience became eternal. Gods watched everything. Spirits punished disobedience. Morality became enforced not just by society, but by the universe itself. Even alone, people feared being judged. This internalized fear was revolutionary. Control no longer required constant violence. People disciplined themselves. As empires expanded, fear scaled with them. No ruler could watch millions directly, but fear could. Stories traveled faster than armies. A single act of brutality could echo across regions, shaping behavior without further action. Fear became economical, efficient, predictable. Entire populations learned the limits of acceptable behavior without being told. Civilization began to rely on fear as infrastructure, as essential as roads or walls. But fear did more than enforce obedience. It shaped culture. It influenced art, architecture, and tradition. Massive monuments were built not only to inspire awe, but to intimidate. Tall walls reminded people of power. Grand palaces reinforced hierarchy. Rituals reinforced order. Even silence had meaning. Fear taught people when to speak and when to remain quiet. It defined roles, expectations, and boundaries. Civilization became organized anxiety. Over time, fear altered how humans thought. Children learned it early. They learned what not to question, what not to say, what not to dream. Fear became inherited, passed quietly from generation to generation. It didn't need constant reinforcement. It lived in habits, glances, and unspoken rules. Civilization advanced technologically, but psychologically, it remained bound to ancient instincts. Yet fear was never neutral. While it built order, it also planted fragility. Systems built on fear required constant maintenance. The moment fear weakened, control slipped. Rulers responded by tightening their grip, often accelerating decay rather than preventing it. Civilization expanded outward, but internally, fear hollowed it from within. By the time humans began recording history, fear was no longer just a reaction. It was policy. It shaped how cities were governed, how wars were fought, and how loyalty was measured. Civilization did not grow despite fear. It grew because of it, and in doing so, it accepted a dangerous truth. The same force that protects order can also destroy it. Fear shaped humanity's foundations. But as history would reveal, foundations built on fear never stop shifting. They crack silently, long before collapse becomes visible. As civilizations matured, fear became quieter, but far more sophisticated. Open violence was no longer always necessary. Power learned to whisper instead of shout. Rulers realized that fear worked best when it was constant but unseen, when people could never be sure where danger truly lived. This uncertainty became its own prison. When fear had no clear source, it spread everywhere. Cities grew dense, populations multiplied, and direct control became impossible. Fear adapted. Surveillance replaced spectacle. Eyes and ears appeared in unexpected places. Neighbors watched neighbors. Servants listened to masters. Priests listened to confessions. Merchants listened in marketplaces. Trust eroded slowly, replaced by caution. Conversations shortened. Truth softened. Silence became survival. Civilization learned to police itself. Fear reshaped loyalty. Obedience was no longer enforced only by punishment, but by anticipation. People obeyed not because they were watched, but because they might be watched. This invisible pressure was more efficient than armies. It required no resources, no violence, no effort. Once fear settled into the mind, it worked endlessly on its own. Rulers began mistaking this silence for stability. Crowds were quiet. Streets were orderly. Resistance appeared gone. But beneath the surface, something darker was forming. Fear suppressed rebellion, but it also suppressed honesty. Advisors learned quickly that truth was dangerous. Warnings softened. Reports were altered. Reality became filtered before reaching power. Leaders began ruling illusions of control rather than the world as it truly was. Over generations, this disconnect grew. Empires made decisions in echo chambers, blind to resentment accumulating below. Citizens adapted in subtle ways. Resistance no longer looked like open defiance. It looked like compliance without loyalty, work without belief, obedience without trust. People followed rules, but withdrew emotionally. Civilization functioned, but its spirit fractured. Fear also reshaped morality. Right and wrong became flexible under authority. Actions once unthinkable became acceptable if framed as protection. Cruelty became justified as necessity. People learned to compartmentalize. They learned how to live beside suffering without reacting. Fear numbed empathy. Survival demanded it. Civilization advanced, but compassion narrowed. Children born into fear-based systems never knew alternatives. They inherited anxiety as normal. Authority felt natural. Questioning felt dangerous even without reason. Fear no longer needed reminders. It lived in posture, tone, and habit. This generational conditioning was one of fear's greatest achievements. It created obedience without force. Yet fear carried a hidden cost. While it prevented chaos, it also prevented renewal. Innovation slowed. Creativity shrank. Societies grew rigid, unable to adapt quickly. Fear discouraged risk, and progress requires risk. Civilizations built on fear grew powerful, but brittle. They could dominate, but struggled to evolve. As time passed, cracks widened. Silent resentment hardened into quiet contempt. Loyalty decayed. When crises emerged, famine, invasion, economic collapse, fear lost its grip. The same people who once obeyed without question now hesitated. Fear could control behavior, but it could not inspire sacrifice. When survival demanded unity, fear offered only isolation. History repeatedly shows this pattern. Fear builds order quickly, but sustains it poorly. It creates obedience, but not resilience. Empires strengthened by fear often fall suddenly, not from rebellion alone, but from internal collapse. When trust vanishes, cooperation dissolves. When truth disappears, decisions fail. When fear replaces loyalty, power becomes fragile. Civilization learned this lesson again and again, but rarely remembered it for long. Fear was too tempting, too effective, too immediate. Each generation believed it could control fear without being consumed by it. History suggests otherwise. As societies grew more complex, fear didn't disappear. It evolved. It shifted shape. And in its final form, it no longer needed chains, walls, or weapons. It lived quietly inside the mind. In its final evolution, fear stopped looking like fear at all. It no longer relied on punishment, spectacle, or constant reminders of authority. Instead, it became normalized, invisible, routine. People woke up afraid without knowing why. Anxiety blended into daily life. Fear no longer announced itself as danger. It disguised itself as responsibility, duty, and order. Civilization had fully absorbed it. Rulers learned that the most powerful form of fear was not terror, but uncertainty. When people were unsure what was allowed, they chose caution. When rules felt vague, obedience felt safer than resistance. Fear no longer needed enforcement. It shaped behavior automatically. Individuals began limiting themselves, censoring thoughts, shrinking ambition, avoiding attention. Control became self-sustaining. This transformation changed how societies collapsed. Empires no longer always fell to invasion or rebellion. Many simply eroded. Fear drained them slowly. People stopped caring deeply. Participation became mechanical. Trust dissolved. Communities weakened. When crises arrived, there was nothing left to hold people together. Fear had taught obedience, but never solidarity. History shows that systems built on fear struggle to recover from shock. When disaster strikes, fear multiplies instead of uniting. People retreat inward. Cooperation fades. Leaders issue commands, but belief is gone. Fear can maintain order during stability, but it accelerates collapse during chaos. Civilizations discover too late that fear is not the same as loyalty. Even when fear-based systems survived, they paid a psychological price. Generations grew disconnected from purpose. Identity narrowed to survival. Moral responsibility faded behind obedience. People learned to follow rather than think, endure rather than change. Civilization continued outwardly, but inwardly, something essential withered. Fear also reshaped memory. Painful histories were buried, distorted, or erased. Admitting past cruelty felt dangerous. Societies avoided reflection because reflection threatened authority. But buried truth does not disappear. It accumulates pressure. Eventually, it returns in unstable forms: rage, extremism, collapse. Fear delays reckoning, but it never eliminates it. Over time, civilizations that relied on fear faced a paradox. The more they suppressed dissent, the less they understood themselves. The quieter society became, the more disconnected power grew from reality. Decisions were made in isolation. Warnings went unheard. Truth became dangerous. Collapse arrived not as surprise, but as consequence. Fear shaped humanity's rise, but it also shaped its limits. It taught survival, but discouraged growth. It built order, but destroyed trust. It enforced obedience, but hollowed meaning. Civilization advanced technologically, yet struggled morally. The tools became more advanced, but the instinct remained ancient. Today, fear has not vanished. It has simply changed form. It hides in systems, narratives, and invisible pressures. It still shapes behavior, still influences obedience, still defines boundaries. Civilization may look different, but fear remains one of its oldest architects. History does not suggest that fear will disappear. It suggests something more unsettling. Fear will always be available, always tempting, always effective in the short term. The question civilizations face is not whether fear works, but what it costs. Every society that chooses fear as its foundation eventually pays the same price. Fear can build civilizations, but it cannot sustain them forever.